Hello, my name is Keith Farnes, and the topic today is vaccines, history, science, ethics. This presentation is approved by the AARC for 1 CRCE credit hour. When we are finished here, you will be able to identify key milestones in vaccine history, explain how the immune system responds to vaccines, and evaluate ethical and societal debates around vaccination. What is a vaccine? Well, it's a substance used to stimulate the production of antibodies and provide immunity against one or several diseases. It is prepared from the causative agent of a disease, its products, or a synthetic substitute treated to act as an antigen without inducing the disease. I'm going to begin with describing a few of the diseases vaccines prevent, because we have forgotten how terrible these were. Imagine it is 1778 and you are a soldier in George Washington's Continental Army. You wake one morning with red blotches on your arms. These blotches quickly within hours become pimple-like bumps. By nightfall, these bumps cover your face, arms, hands, including palms, legs, and feet, including soles. These bumps turn into pustules and then boils. Fever sets in. They spread over your entire body, including the inside of your mouth and tongue. These boils spread and merge, causing the skin to flake off. The pain is unbearable. Think measles on steroids. You just came down with smallpox. Smallpox was an infectious disease caused by one of two virus variants, variola major and variola minor. The initial symptoms of the disease included fever and vomiting. This was followed by formation of sores in the mouth and a skin rash. Over a number of days, the skin rash turned into characteristic fluid-filled bumps with a dent in the center. The bumps then scabbed over and fell off, leaving scars. The disease was spread between people or via contaminated objects such as blankets. It killed 1 in 3. Smallpox has been around for a long time. In 10,000 BC, it is believed to have appeared in Africa. 180 AD, major epidemic coincides with the fall of the Roman Empire. 1500 1800 AD, introduction of smallpox to the New World decimated the native population. Disease killed more natives than guns ever did. Variolation, or inoculation, was the method first used to immunize an individual against smallpox. The Chinese introduced this in 1600 as early vaccination. This involved exposing a person to a weakened form of the virus. Material was taken from an infected patient or a recently variolated person in the hope that a mild but protective infection would result. Sometimes smallpox scabs were ground up and blown up a person's nostrils. It is difficult to pinpoint when the practice began, as some sources claim dates as early as 200 BCE. In 1796, Edward Jenner used cowpox extract to vaccinate against smallpox. From there we got to our modern forms of vaccination. In 1967, the World Health Organization started a campaign to eradicate smallpox. In 1972, routine vaccination ceased. The last naturally occurring case was diagnosed in October 1977. In 1980, the WHO declared smallpox dead. The humans had won the war against smallpox. Perhaps the best news ever for mankind. Your 3-year-old daughter develops a runny nose, is sneezing, and has a low-grade fever. These symptoms last about 2 weeks and you assume it's just a common cold. Bouts of intense coughing start. These could last 1 to 10 weeks and get more intense every night. These coughing spells make it so hard for her to breathe that she makes a loud whooping sound as she gasps for air in between the coughs. Luckily, she has survived but continues to have sporadic coughing spells for the next couple of months. In China, pertussis is known as the 100-day cough. Pertussis is also known as whooping cough, and it is caused by a very contagious bacteria which attach to the cilia that line the part of the upper respiratory system. The bacteria release toxins, aka poisons, which damage the cilia and cause the airways to swell. Pertussis and its complications can sometimes lead to death. In the current era, worldwide, its prevalence is about 20 to 40 million cases per year, and it leads to 200,000 to 400,000 deaths annually. You are traveling through Cambodia on vacation, and after eating some delicious pho soup from a street vendor, you start to develop stomach pain, headache, and some red spots across your body. Within a short period of time, you are afflicted with diarrhea and extreme weakness. Eventually, you are taken to a hospital for treatment with antibiotics. People contract typhoid fever by ingesting contaminated food or water. Symptoms are poor appetite, headaches, diarrhea, generalized aches and pains, fever, and lethargy. Antibiotics treat typhoid fever. Approximately 3 to 5% of patients then become carriers of the bacteria after the acute illness. You may have heard of a person called Typhoid Mary who was an asymptomatic typhoid carrier and worked as a cook. She was known to have infected at least 51 people with typhoid fever, and at least 3 of those died. Probably more. She was held under quarantine for about the last 20 years of her life. She was placed in healthcare jail. Diphtheria is dangerous because the bacteria produces a powerful toxin. The toxin kills cells in the mouth, nose, and throat. A sheet of thick gray matter covers the back of the throat, making breathing difficult. Symptoms include sore throat, fever, swollen lymph nodes, and weakness. It kills 1 in 10. In 1735, a diphtheria epidemic swept through New England. In some cases, entire families died of the disease. In one New Hampshire town, 32% of children under 10 died. The case fatality ratio was almost 40%. One of the solutions used to save lives was tracheostomy. Imagine getting a trach in the 1700s before the discovery of anesthesia or antibiotics. Measles is an infectious disease caused by a virus. It spreads easily from person to person. It causes a blotchy red rash with bumps. The rash often starts on the head and moves down the body. I came down with the measles in the 1980s when I was in my 20s, and it almost killed me. The bumps even developed inside my eyelids, causing scratches to my corneas. This caused immense pain from any light. I had to stay in a darkened room and wear sunglasses. Just the light from the TV was unbearable. Any time I ate or drank, it caused vomiting, and I lost 40 pounds in 3 weeks. I don't recommend it. Measles is one of the most contagious infectious diseases known. Around 90% of non-immune close contacts of a measles case will become infected if exposed. Babies don't get the measles vaccine until 12 months of age because maternal antibodies make it less effective before then. The next few slides are a few pictures of people with measles. There was once a guy named Cotton Mather, who was a prominent Boston clergyman, who would later bring smallpox variolation to the colonies. But in 1713 he wrote in his diary of an approaching measles epidemic. The measles are coming into the town. In short order, as the rest of the town suffered, measles infected most of his family. Within a few weeks it killed his wife, his newborn twins, another daughter, and the family's maid. In 1757, the infectious nature of measles was shown by Scottish physician Francis Home. He was able to transmit measles from infected patients to healthy individuals via blood, demonstrating that the disease was caused by an infectious agent. Imagine being a test subject in that experiment. In 1732, a yellow fever epidemic struck Charleston, South Carolina, with deaths occurring so frequently that the usual ringing of the bells upon a death was forbidden. Yellow fever still exists and is super dangerous. Here is a timeline of vaccination, which we are going to discuss in further detail. Of note, Jenner discovered vaccination in 1796, and about 100 years later we have legal battles regarding vaccine mandates. In 1796, Edward Jenner observed that dairymaids who had cowpox didn't get smallpox. He inoculated James Phipps, age 8, with cowpox material from milkmaid Sarah Nelms. Phipps had a mild illness, recovered, and later resisted smallpox exposure. Jenner repeated the experiment and showed vaccination gave protection without the variolation risks. In 1836, English physician Edward Ballard noted that cowpox transmitted from human to human seemed to decline in potency over time. He recommended choosing new strains of cowpox and reintroducing the pustular matter back into the cows to boost its potency. This method came to be used to supply sufficient material for vaccination. The United Kingdom Vaccination Act of 1853 made smallpox vaccination mandatory in the first 3 months of an infant's life. A parent's penalty for not complying was a fine or imprisonment. In 1855, Massachusetts passed the first U.S. law mandating vaccination for school children. This has been challenged in court and upheld. In 1879, Louis Pasteur produced the first laboratory-developed vaccine, the vaccine for chicken cholera. Pasteur attenuated or weakened the bacteria for use in the vaccine. He happened upon the method of attenuation by accident in his lab. He was studying fowl cholera by injecting chickens with the live bacteria and recording the fatal progression of the illness, watching how they died. He had instructed an assistant to inject the chickens with a fresh culture of the bacteria before a holiday. The assistant, however, forgot. When the assistant returned a month later, he carried out Pasteur's wishes. The chickens, while showing mild signs of the disease, survived. When they were healthy again, Pasteur injected them with fresh bacteria. The chickens did not become ill. Pasteur eventually reasoned the factor that made the bacteria less deadly was exposure to oxygen. In 1882, the Anti-Vaccination League of America held its first meeting in New York. Among the assertions made by the speakers at the meeting was the idea that smallpox was spread not by contagion but by filth. This became a popular though incorrect argument of anti-vaccinationists. In 1893, there was a Muncie, Indiana smallpox outbreak that illustrated the effect of lower vaccination rates on the spread of the disease. A local physician noted that vaccination there had been largely neglected since the last epidemic of smallpox in 1876. The initial cases appeared in a family in which only one member had been vaccinated. The physicians were unsure whether the disease was smallpox or chickenpox and established a quarantine, but too late to control the disease spread. Despite measures that included a near quarantine of the city, fumigation of mail, cancellation of public gatherings, and compulsory vaccination, the epidemic spread from May 1893 through October. In the end, 140 people contracted smallpox and 20 died. In 1894, the first major documented polio outbreak in the United States occurred in Rutland County, Vermont. 18 deaths and 132 cases of permanent paralysis were reported. In 1898, the British Vaccination Act of that year provided a conscious clause to allow exemptions to mandatory smallpox vaccination. This clause gave rise to the term conscientious objector, which later came to refer to those opposed to military service. By the end of the year, magistrates had issued more than 200,000 vaccination exemptions. Anti-vaccinationists in England, other parts of Europe, and the United States were active in publishing, speaking, and demonstrating about their objections to vaccination. The 1900s saw many advances. In 1901, contamination leads to stronger regulations. The Camden, New Jersey tetanus outbreak was linked to contaminated smallpox vaccine. This incident, along with a St. Louis, Missouri tetanus outbreak traced to contaminated diphtheria antitoxin, led to the U.S. regulation of biologic products the following year. In 1905, the U.S. Supreme Court, in the case of Jacobson v. Massachusetts, upheld the constitutionality of mandatory smallpox vaccination programs to preserve the public health. The Arrel smallpox incident was a July 30, 1971 outbreak of the viral disease which occurred as a result of a field test at a Soviet biological weapons facility on an island in the Aral Sea. The incident sickened 10 people, of whom 3 died. The high ratio of hemorrhagic smallpox cases in this outbreak, combined with the rate of infectivity and the testimony of a Russian general, has led to the understanding that an enhanced weaponized strain of smallpox virus was accidentally released. In August 1978, Janet Parker, a photographer employed by the University of Birmingham Medical School in Great Britain, died of smallpox. Parker had worked in a darkroom 1 floor above a research laboratory where work was being done with the live smallpox virus. It was later discovered that the World Health Organization had informed Henry Bedson, the head of the medical microbiology department, that the facilities did not meet WHO's standards. Bedson, however, did not act on the WHO's recommendations for changes in lab procedures and, in fact, lied about the amount of work being done in the laboratory. Poor Janet Parker was killed by a lab leak. Currently, there are 32 human vaccine preventable diseases, 20 viral, 10 bacterial, and 2 bacterial toxins. Let's move on to the science of how all this works. We're going to begin this section with a discussion of the immune system, and of course the big thing is the ability to identify self cells versus invader cells. The first line of defense is physical barriers, intact skin. Sebaceous skin glands secrete an oily, waxy substance which helps waterproof the skin. Sweat makes the skin pH 4 to 5. This makes it inhospitable to many bacteria. Mucus in the airways and GI tract trap pathogens expelled on cough or sneeze. Mucus also has antimicrobial proteins. Tears, saliva wash away pathogens and inhibit growth. Stomach acid kills many pathogens. So does taking meds that decrease stomach acid increase your chance of catching a disease? For some diseases, the answer is yes. As with everything else we do, you must weigh risk versus benefit. Vaginal secretions are slightly acidic, which discourages microbial growth. Semen contains antimicrobial proteins and zinc, which kills many pathogens. And fever can impair the ability of pathogens to replicate. Increasing the temperature also disrupts the pathogen's metabolism. The innate immune system, you're born with this, has three characteristics. It's nonspecific, responds the same way to all pathogens. It can recognize a variety of pathogens and non-infectious proteins. The response is immediate, minutes to hours, not days. But the response never changes. It has no memory to help improve efficiency. This means it responds the same way no matter how often it is exposed to the same pathogen. Usually takes 10 to 14 days for maximal response. The complement system is part of the immune system that enhances or complements the ability of antibodies and phagocytic cells to clear microbes and damaged cells from an organism, promote inflammation, and attack the pathogen's cell membrane. It has no memory of previous actions. It doesn't change throughout your life, but it does help your adaptive immune system. The adaptive immune system is called that because of long-term changes that occur when it interacts with pathogens. This acts as memory. And there are two branches in this system: cell-mediated and antibody-mediated humoral system. Humoral means body fluid. For cell types, you've got neutrophils. These are the most abundant leukocytes, 60 to 70%. These are the first responders, especially bacterial, but also to toxins and fungi. Then there's eosinophils, found in highest concentrations in mucous membranes, respiratory, GI, urinary tracts. These attack parasites and bacteria, often increased in allergic asthma. Basophils are the least common leukocyte. They release histamine, which dilates blood vessels and causes an inflammatory response. We often don't like this response, so we take antihistamines. Mast cells also release histamine and they attack internal parasites. Monocytes develop into macrophages. Macrophages engulf pathogens and present it to the T cells. These also eat dead and damaged neutrophils and pathogens. Dendritic cells, not to be confused with dendrites, are the most efficient at engulfing pathogens and presenting it to the T cells. And then there's natural killer cells. They remove virus-infected cells and tumor cells. They may be retained as a type of memory cell. And there are two main types of leukocytes in the adaptive system: T leukocytes, or T cells, which are made in the thymus, hence the T, and B leukocytes, made in the bone marrow, hence the B. The response is highly specific. Each cell, not cell type, but each individual cell, only responds to one antigen. Antigen, by the way, is short for antibody generator or any foreign substance. Primary response the first time is slow, takes 10 to 17 days, so about 2 weeks, for maximal response. Once the pathogens have been destroyed, T and B cells remain behind and remember the pathogen. The next time it shows up, it may only take a few days to respond. Often you don't even get sick. This ability to remember is the basis for active immunity and vaccines. Immunological memory doesn't exist in the innate system. Vaccines work by stimulating the production of memory cells without causing the illness. Childhood vaccines are about 90% effective. Adult vaccines are less. If you do get sick, the symptoms are generally less severe and many people are protected by herd immunity, which I'll discuss in a few minutes. The adaptive system rids the body of pathogens by the production of antibodies. Antibodies are also called immunoglobulins, IgS. These are very tiny proteins produced by B cells. There are 5 classes of immunoglobulins and each has its own function. Immunoglobulin A protects against pathogens entering the body, especially mucous membranes. IgD initiates B cell response. IgE attacks parasites and stimulates inflammatory response in allergic reactions. and they combine with mast cells to release histamine. Immunotherapy works to reduce these and increase IgG and IgA antibodies. IgG enhances phagocytosis and also neutralizes toxins like tetanus and viruses. They're formed against specific invaders and take about 2 weeks to develop. They generally last a lifetime. IgM is highly effective against bacteria. When we are first born, the immune system is still developing and most of the immunity is received from the mother. As we get old, so on the other end of life, our immune system doesn't work as well, which is why you will often hear about the very young and the very old being susceptible to a pathogen like the flu. Besides age, other things that can degrade our immune system is long-term stress, chemo, radiation, and environmental toxins. Of course, sometimes things go haywire and you can get an autoimmune disorder like lupus, where your immune system is attacking your self cells. There are several different types of immunity. Active immunity, which is the immunity which results from the production of antibodies by the immune system in response to the presence of an antigen. Then there's herd immunity, the resistance to the spread of a contagious disease within a population that results if a sufficiently high proportion of individuals are immune to the disease, especially through vaccination. In other words, if enough other people get vaccinated, an unvaccinated person is still protected. Some physicians and anti-vaccine books are telling parents that if they choose not to vaccinate their children, they will be protected by herd immunity. However, when enough parents do this, the percentage of children who have been vaccinated falls and outbreaks occur. Cell-mediated immunity is an immune response that does not involve antibodies. Rather than cell-mediated immunity is the activation of phagocytes, antigen-specific cytotoxic T lymphocytes, and the release of various cytokines in response to an antigen. Humoral immunity is the aspect of immunity that is mediated by macromolecules found in extracellular fluids such as secreted antibodies, complement proteins, and certain antimicrobial peptides. Humoral immunity is so named because it involves substances found in the humors or body fluids. Now that you have a working understanding of the immune response, let's get into vaccines and immunization. The goal of immunization is simple: to produce active immunity without developing symptoms of the disease. There are various types of vaccines. There's the live attenuated, which is created by reducing the virulence of a pathogen, but still keeping it viable or live. Attenuation takes an infectious agent and alters it so that it becomes harmless or less virulent. These vaccines contrast to those produced by killing the virus, inactivated vaccine. So an inactivated vaccine consists of virus particles, bacteria, or other pathogens that have been grown in culture and then lose disease-producing capacity. Toxoid vaccines are made from a toxin that has been made harmless but that elicits an immune response against the toxin. These are based on the toxin produced by certain bacteria, like tetanus or diphtheria. A subunit vaccine contains only the minimal microbial elements necessary to stimulate long-lasting protective or therapeutic immune responses. For polysaccharides, only the sugar part of the bacteria, the capsule, is included as the antigen to stimulate the immune response. Conjugate vaccines is where the sugar is joined to the carrier protein, and polyvalent vaccines immunize against more than one strain of an antigen. For example, the polyvalent pneumococcal vaccine protects against several strains of the pneumococcal bacteria. Combination vaccines offer protections from multiple diseases like diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, trivalent IPV, which is 3 strains of inactivated polio, MMR, measles, mumps, rubella, etc. And that brings us to the current COVID vaccines, which are mRNA vaccines or messenger RNA. It sends instructions to our own cells to make the spike protein of the virus. Once you start making the spike protein, your immune system starts attacking it. Your body only creates the spike protein, not the entire virus, so you will not get sick. Your immune system destroys the spikes and even breaks down the mRNA vaccine. The only thing left is the memory of how to kill the virus. This technology allows us to develop new vaccines much quicker. Once we have the DNA or RNA sequence of a virus, it's a fairly quick process when compared to traditional vaccines. Since we are only telling our bodies to create a tiny part of the virus, we won't get sick from the actual virus. An interesting outcome is that this technology may help eradicate many other diseases like malaria. Do they work? None are 100%. Most are about 90% in children and less in adults. Some need booster shots to remain effective. Flu is usually around 40 to 70%. I know some people who refer to this as a flu shot, not a flu vaccine, due to its low rate of effectiveness. The WHO estimates that vaccination against just diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, and measles prevents 2 to 3 million deaths per year. I want to take a few minutes to talk specifically about the newer vaccines, COVID and RSV. These will probably be the ones you are most asked about by your patients. You should be prepared with thoughtful answers. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, there was the SARS outbreak in 2003 and MERS in 2012. These were also coronaviruses, but were easier to contain because they were far less transmissible. However, the death rate was much higher at about 10% for SARS and 35% for MERS, making them far deadlier. SARS-CoV-2, known as COVID-19, was around 1%. So coronavirus research was not new. Scientists had already studied SARS and MERS, so the spike protein was already identified as the key antigen for immunity. Decades of research on the mRNA vaccines for cancer and other viruses had already been done, which meant the platform was nearly ready for large-scale use before SARS-CoV-2 appeared. Also, by January 2020, the full genetic code of SARS-CoV-2 was published online, so vaccine development could start almost immediately. There were several different designs of COVID vaccines. For the mRNA vaccines from Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna, scientists took the viral RNA sequence that encodes the spike protein, made a synthetic mRNA copy, and enclosed it in lipid nanoparticles so it could enter human cells. The AstraZeneca Johnson & Johnson viral vector vaccine used a harmless adenovirus that was engineered to carry the gene for the spike protein. Once inside the body, the cells produce the spike protein and trigger immunity. Novavax was a protein subunit vaccine, where purified pieces of the spike protein were produced in lab systems and combined with an adjuvant, which is an ingredient that boosts the body's immune response to the vaccine, making it more effective to stimulate the immune system. The clinical trial phases overlapped. Instead of waiting for each trial phase to finish completely, some phases like animal studies, phase 1, 2, and 3 human trials ran in parallel, saving time. Tens of thousands of volunteers were available. Clinical trials tested vaccines for safety, immune response, and protection against COVID-19. Independent review boards and global regulatory agencies continuously reviewed the data. Normally, companies wait for trial results before scaling up production. But for COVID-19, governments funded manufacturing at risk, meaning vaccine doses were produced before they were approved, so distribution could begin immediately once authorized. Regulators gave emergency use authorization after reviewing safety and efficacy data. Pfizer's first was in December 2020. This is not cutting corners. The same safety standards applied, but data was reviewed continuously instead of waiting until the very end. Vaccines were rolled out in late 2020 and 2021. Ongoing monitoring systems in the US and others worldwide continue to track side effects and effectiveness. To be clear, COVID-19 vaccines were created fast because of prior research, modern genetic technology, global collaboration, overlapping trials, and pre-funded manufacturing, not because steps were skipped. Let's move on to the RSV vaccines, which are a major milestone in infectious disease prevention. They reduce severe RSV disease in older adults and infants. Combined with monoclonal antibodies, they form a strong new strategy against RSV. What is RSV? Respiratory syncytial virus is a common respiratory virus that infects the lungs and airways. Most children get it by age 2, usually causing mild cold-like symptoms. In healthy children and adults, RSV usually causes mild cold-like illness with a very low fatality rate. Globally, RSV is a leading cause of hospitalization in children under 5. Most deaths occur in low and middle income countries. High income countries, the infant death rate is far lower, well under 1% of hospitalized infants. Older adults that are 65 years of age or older, or those with chronic conditions like COPD, heart disease, weakened immune systems, etc., are at highest risk. In the U.S., RSV causes about 60 to 160,000 hospitalizations and between 6 and 10,000 deaths annually in older adults. The estimated mortality rate in hospitalized older adults is somewhere between 5 and 10%. So the bottom line, healthy children and adults, rarely fatal. Infants, less than 6 months, especially premature, can be severe. Older adults, 6 to 10,000 deaths per year in the U.S. And infants, older adults, and immunocompromised people, it can cause severe bronchiolitis, pneumonia, and hospitalization. For decades, making an RSV vaccine was challenging because the virus mutates. An early vaccine in the 1960s actually made children sicker. This is known as vaccine-enhanced disease. The breakthrough came when scientists stabilized the RSV F protein, known as the fusion protein, in its pre-fusion form. This is what the immune system needs to recognize to produce strong neutralizing antibodies. The first RSV vaccine was approved on May 3, 2023. Now there are 4 approved, and the FDA is currently reviewing data on RSV vaccines for adults 18 to 49 years of age at increased risk for severe RSV disease. The early skepticism and rejection of vaccines gave way to almost universal acceptance. In fact, between 1901 and 1954, 6 Nobel Prizes in physiology or medicine recognized research related to vaccines. However, small groups of skeptics always existed. Since the 1990s, this small group has continued to get larger. What changed? The rise of the Internet. Perceived risk can be a strong influencer. Imagine you watch a news story about what happened to someone who took the MMR vaccine and had an extreme adverse reaction. It is a very well put together show, complete with lots of emotional tie-ins. Now you're scared. I tell people that if they aren't afraid of the measles, perhaps they should be afraid of math. The risk of an adverse vaccine reaction is about 1 in 2.2 million vaccines. The risk of dying from measles is about 1 in 1,000. However, many people are more afraid of the adverse reaction instead of the disease due to scary stories. People naturally respond more to personal scary stories than to statistics. What would the impact have been if instead of telling you the story of Cotton Mather's family dying, I had just listed statistical numbers instead? Therefore, parents will weigh the risk of getting a vaccine versus the risk of not. What are the odds of catching the disease? Many of us don't remember these diseases because we have never seen anyone with it. This is why I spent the time earlier to describe them and give you a brief history lesson. How many polio victims have you met? Probably very few, if any. In the 1950s, polio was very scary. 35,000 cases in the U.S. per year. It was so bad many parents wouldn't let their kids play with other kids because they didn't want them to catch it. Your kids were fine one day and woke up paralyzed the next. Now polio only exists in the wild in 3 countries: Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Nigeria. Have you ever met anyone from these countries or someone who has traveled to these countries? Is it possible you could be exposed to polio? Statistical risk can further be broken down into adverse events and adverse effects. An adverse event is something reported after a person was vaccinated. The vaccine didn't necessarily cause it, but it was reported. Someone might report being overtired, cranky, headache, etc. Adverse effects are undesirable experiences that are caused by the administration of the vaccine. These are harder to pin down. There is a government surveillance program called the Vaccine Safety Data Link, VSD, that uses information from healthcare providers to determine the background rate for certain disorders in unvaccinated children. In other words, how often does something normally happen and compare that to reported adverse effects? And by the way, overdose is unlikely because vaccines are never self-administered. Plus, many vaccines require multiple doses, and if a person has been fully dosed without complications, an additional dose rarely causes problems. The Q vaccine is an exception to this. The Q vaccine can cause serious adverse reactions if given more than once. What the heck is the Q vaccine? Q fever is like the flu and can spread from animals, mainly cattle, sheep, and goats, to humans. Underdosing happens when a person fails to complete the required series of shots. Like hepatitis B is a series of 3 shots, and you will not be fully immunized if you only get 2 and then quit. People are natural optimists. Bad things will happen to other people and not to ourselves. And people are more familiar with stories of adverse effects, like stories of autism caused by the MMR vaccine, than stories of people having the measles. The theory that vaccines cause autism traces back to the 1990s. In 1995, British gastroenterologist Andrew Wakefield and colleagues suggested a link between the MMR vaccine, bowel disease, and later autism. In 1998, Wakefield published a case series of 12 children in The Lancet reporting measles virus in the intestines of autistic children after the MMR vaccination. Although the paper itself did not claim causation, Wakefield publicly suggested MMR caused autistic enterocolitis and recommended single antigen vaccines. He did not say don't get a vaccine, he said don't get the combined MMR vaccine. Surprisingly, he had also filed a patent for such a vaccine, raising conflict of interest concerns. The publication triggered widespread media coverage, parental fear, and falling vaccination rates in the UK and the US. Over the next decade, numerous large studies found no link between MMR and autism. In 2004, it was revealed Wakefield had been paid by lawyers suing vaccine makers, and most co-authors retracted their interpretation. The Lancet formally retracted the paper in 2010, and Wakefield was banned from practicing medicine in the UK. He lost his medical license. In 2011, journalist Brian Deere exposed evidence of fraud where medical records contradicted claims in the paper about symptom timing, prior development, and diagnosis. The British Medical Journal concluded Wakefield falsified data, calling the study not only flawed but fraudulent. Despite being thoroughly discredited, the paper's impact on vaccine confidence persists. So MMR is not the only vaccine or vaccine component that has been targeted for scrutiny by those who suspect vaccination might be related to autism. After the MMR controversy died down, critics turned their questions to thimerosal, a mercury-containing preservative used in some vaccines. It had never been used in the MMR vaccine, as antimicrobial agents are not used in live vaccines. In the late 1990s, lawmakers, environmentalists, and medical and public health workers became concerned about environmental exposures to mercury, particularly from consumption of fish. With heightened attention to known and potential harmful effects of such exposures, the FDA in 1999 requested that drug companies report on amounts of mercury in their products. The results for mercury in vaccines exceeded FDA guidelines for exposures to the kind of mercury found in fish. Now, it's important to realize that mercury in fish appears in the form of methylmercury, which is not readily metabolized or excreted by the human body, which means it accumulates. Methylmercury is known to cause, at certain levels of exposure, harmful neurological effects. The mercury in thimerosal metabolizes in the body to ethylmercury, a compound that, while not widely studied at the time, was thought to be much less harmful than methylmercury. However, the FDA had a dilemma. Should methylmercury guidelines apply to ethylmercury? Today, thimerosal is no longer used in most childhood vaccines and recently was banned altogether. After thimerosal was removed from most vaccines, autism rates did not drop. Rather, they continued to rise. Some vaccine critics shifted their attention from hypothesized mercury exposure, autism connection to other targets. One such target is the number of vaccines given to children. Many vaccines have been added to the childhood immunization schedule since the 1980s, and some critics have voiced concern that this increase in vaccine exposure results in autism. However, no evidence of an association between increased exposure to vaccines and autism has appeared. Others have focused on the aluminum in some vaccines as a potential cause of autism. Yet the amounts of aluminum used in vaccines are small in comparison to other exposures to aluminum, such as in breast milk and infant formula. Aluminum in vaccines has not been implicated in any infant or childhood health problems. Most scientific and medical experts are satisfied that no connection exists between vaccines and autism and other neurodevelopmental disorders. Still, critics continue to question the issue. Most autism researchers hold that the causes of autism are many and include genetic and environmental factors, but do not involve vaccines. Another theory is that improved living conditions and sanitation, like clean water, better nutrition, better sewage treatment, advances in medical treatment, less crowded housing, have caused a reduction in contagious disease, not vaccines. While all these things are super important and have contributed to higher quality of living and longevity, the science doesn't support this theory. Before 1963, there were about 500,000 cases per year of the measles in the U.S. After the measles vaccine was introduced, rates dropped by 95%. The chiropractic field founder, Daniel David Palmer, believed that all diseases were caused by a misalignment of the joints and could be cured by joint manipulation. While not all chiropractors endorse this belief, many still do. Brain damage, developmental delays, allergies, multiple sclerosis, Gulf War syndrome, and even AIDS has been blamed on vaccines. In 1992, Rolling Stone magazine published an article called The Origin of AIDS that suggested the polio vaccine was contaminated with chimpanzee virus that caused AIDS. The story was discredited. Early on, Christian church leaders were opposed to Jenner's cowpox vaccination as they believed smallpox was sent as God's punishment. Today, no major religions oppose vaccination. Some vaccines contain porcine-derived gelatin or may have used pig-derived enzymes in manufacturing. This can cause religious and ethical considerations. Many Jewish and Islamic authorities have ruled that gelatin in vaccines is permissible because it is highly processed and no longer considered pork in its original form. Some vegetarians or vegans prefer to avoid animal-derived products, though alternatives are limited. Some manufacturers are developing alternatives using non-pork gelatin like fish or synthetic sources, but availability varies by country. In September 2025, there was a measles outbreak in Indonesia where 2,600 children were infected and 20 died. Parents did not want to give their children the vaccine because in 2018 it was ruled forbidden by religious leaders because of the pig gelatin. Too many vaccines too soon, overwhelming the immune system. We are exposed to thousands of bacteria and viruses daily, starting immediately at birth. Adding 2 or 3 more is hardly a problem. Hepatitis B vaccine is given within a few days of birth before leaving the hospital. HPV vaccine needs to be given before people are sexually active. This will protect them against HPV and possibly cervical cancer. Some parents question giving it so early, like age 11 or 12, when their kids won't be having sex until they're adults. Also, some are concerned it will make their children sexually active, even though not receiving the vaccine may result in contracting HPV and possibly cervical cancer and kill them later in life. Mandatory versus personal choice. The government shouldn't tell me what to do with my body. Courts have held that the greater good outweighs individual rights. Courts have also upheld employer rights to require vaccines, such as annual flu shots. However, times are changing. The fights over the COVID vaccines really pushed the individual choice argument to a tipping point. In September 2025, Florida Surgeon General Dr. Joseph Ladapo announced that the state intends to end all vaccine mandates, including those for school attendance. They have admitted they did not perform any studies examining the effects of removing mandates, at least not publicly. Dr. Ladapo said, "It's an issue of right and wrong in terms of whether parents should be able to control what happens to their kids' bodies." Community good versus personal choice. And some are too young to get vaccinated. As I mentioned, the first dose of MMR is at 1 year old. Suppose I choose not to get the MMR vaccine and exposed your infant daughter, who was too young to get vaccinated, to measles, who then died. How do you like me now? GMO foods are scary enough. What will happen when we start messing around with our DNA? Should we mess around in a lab with these viruses and bacteria? Accidents can and have happened. One of the theories of the origin of the COVID-19 pandemic is a lab leak. Bioweapons have been used during wars and could be used again with unknown consequences. In conclusion, since the initial introduction of vaccines, people have resisted due to poor understanding of science, resistance to government intervention in what they see as a personal choice, and misinformation. I hope in this lecture you've learned more about the history of the disastrous consequences brought by diseases that are prevented by our current vaccines. Certain vaccines, such as MMR, have gotten a bad reputation due to misinformation, fraudulent studies, and scare tactics by those that have a financial interest in the topic. Should you take a vaccine? Should you give vaccines to your children? Should the government be able to force you to take a vaccine? These are tough questions. In the end, it may come down to which are you more afraid of, the vaccine or the disease. Since 1924, it is estimated that vaccines have prevented 103 million cases of polio, measles, rubella, mumps, hepatitis A, diphtheria, and pertussis. Please tell your at-risk patients to consider vaccination. If they say they considered it and the answer is no, then okay, don't argue with them. If they are vaccine hesitant, I would tell them that COVID may not be as important as it used to be since it has mutated to more of a common cold, but it still kills people. Flu and pneumonia are certainly killing people, so they should at least take those. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., as HHS Secretary, fired all members of the CDC's Vaccine Advisory Committee on June 9, 2025. Some of the new appointees are known vaccine critics or skeptics. The future of vaccines in our country is still to be written. And that brings us to everyone's favorite slide, the end.